Desperately, the pilots fought against the airplane, and they were flabbergasted. The pitch of the airplane was nose up, and it should have been climbing. To the horror of everyone aboard, the aircraft was falling like a stone toward the icy cold Atlantic Ocean at an alarming rate. As one of the pilots desperately pulled back on his side stick, warnings blared in the cockpit. "Pull up! Pull up! Pull up!" the warnings cried as the ocean grew nearer and nearer. "We're going to crash, it can't be true," exclaimed one of the pilots in utter disbelief, but desperately trying to recover control of the aircraft until the very last moment. For 3 years the world would wonder, what happened to Flight 447? Air France Flight 447 is an infamous crash in the aviation disaster community, and for good reason. The devastating nature of the crash and the hope that was so quickly dashed are crushing, yet sickly fascinating. To start our explanation of this disaster, let's look at the aircraft. The aircraft involved here was a 4-year-old Airbus A330-203, with serial number 0660 and registered as FGZCP. The plane was delivered to Air France in April of 2005 and was the last Airbus A330 delivered to Air France. How old were you in 2005? Let me know in the comments section. This aircraft underwent a major overhaul on April 16, 2009, and at the time of the accident had accumulated around 18,870 flying hours. As for our flight crew, we had 12 crew in total, 9 of them cabin crew and 3 in the cockpit. 11 out of 12 crew were French and 1 was Brazilian. Our pilot in command and our PNF, or pilot not flying, for this flight was Captain Marc Dubois, 58, who had joined Air France from a rival company, Air Inter, in February 1988 and had 10,988 flight hours, of which 6,258 were as captain and about 1,700 were on the Airbus A330. He'd done 16 rotations in the South America sector since arriving in the A330-A340 division in 2007. The crew's relief co-pilot in the left seat was First Officer David Robert, 37, who joined Air France in July 1998 and had 6,547 flight hours, of which 4,479 were on the Airbus A330. He'd done 39 rotations in the South America sector since arriving in the A330-A340 division in 2002. He'd graduated from École Nationale de l'Aviation Civile, one of the elite Grande École, and had transitioned from a pilot to a management job at the Airlines Operations Center. He was serving as a pilot for this flight to maintain his flying credentials. And finally, the co-pilot and PF, or pilot flying, in the right seat was First Officer Pierre-Cedric Bonin, 32, who joined Air France in July of 1998 and had 2,900 flight hours, of which 807 were on the Airbus A330. He'd done 5 rotations in the South America sector since arriving in the A330-A340 division in 2008. His wife, Isabel, a physics teacher, was one of the passengers on this flight. Speaking of passengers, on Flight 447, there were 216 passengers. 126 of them were men, 82 were women, and 8 were children, including 1 infant. The majority of the passengers were French, Brazilian, or German citizens, but there were passengers and crew of 33 nationalities on this flight. Many of the passengers were business and holiday travelers. It was the evening of May 31st, 2009. The skies were clear, and the temperature was a mild winter day in Brazil, with temperatures in the high 60s and low 70s. Flights were scheduled as normal, and it seemed as though it would remain a fair and pleasant evening. For the passengers and crew of Flight 447, this day would be their last. AF-447 departed Rio de Janeiro Galeão International Airport on May 31st, 2009 at 10:29 p.m. Coordinated Universal Time. They were scheduled to land at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport at 9:03 a.m. UTC the next day, an estimated flight time of 10 hours and 34 minutes. In summary, voice contact with the aircraft was lost around 1:35 a.m. UTC, 3 hours and 6 minutes into the flight. The last message reported that the aircraft had passed waypoint Intal off Natal on Brazil's northeastern coast. The aircraft left Brazilian Atlantic radar surveillance at 1:49 a.m. and entered a communication dead zone. After that, we only know what happened based upon the black box and CVR recordings. Let's back up for a minute. The weather in the mid-Atlantic was normal for this time of year, and included a broad band of thunderstorms along the Intertropical Convergence Zone. A meteorological analysis of the area surrounding the flight path showed a mesoscale convective system extending to an altitude of around 50,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean before AF 447 disappeared. During its final hour, Flight 447 encountered areas of light turbulence. Commercial air transport crews routinely encounter this type of storm in this area. With the aircraft under the control of its automated systems, one of the main tasks occupying the cockpit crew was that of monitoring the progress of the flight through the Intertropical Convergence Zone, using the onboard weather radar to avoid areas of significant turbulence. 12 other flights had recently shared more or less the same route that Flight 447 was using at the time of the accident. And unfortunately, Flight 447 would not be as lucky as these other flights. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comment section below. Alright, let's get into the disaster. The Airbus A330 is designed to be flown by 2 pilots, but the 13-hour duty time, or total flight duration with pre-flight preparation, required for the Rio to Paris route exceeded the 10 hours permitted before a pilot had to take a break as dictated by Air France's procedures. To comply, AF 447 was crewed by 3 cockpit crew, a captain and 2 first officers. With 3 pilots aboard, each could take a break in the A330's rest cabin, located behind the cockpit. So, in accordance with common practice, Captain Dubois sent First Officer Robert for the first rest period with the intention of taking the second himself. At 1:55 a.m., he woke First Officer Robert and said, quote, "He's going to take my place." After attending the briefing between the 2 co-pilots, the captain left the cockpit to rest at 2:01:46 a.m. At 2:06 a.m., the pilot warned the cabin crew they were about to enter an area of turbulence. About 2 to 3 minutes later, the aircraft encountered icing conditions. The CVR picked up sounds akin to hail on the outside of the aircraft, and ice crystals began to accumulate in the pitot tubes. A pitot tube measures fluid flow velocity and is widely used to determine the airspeed of an aircraft, the water speed of boats, and the flow velocity of liquids, airs, and gases in industry work. If a pitot tube on an Airbus A330 becomes frozen over or blocked, the airspeed indicator will behave erratically or show false readings, which is extremely dangerous. Depending upon if the drain hole is clogged or not, the indicator will either show the airspeed at 0 as if the plane is stopped, or it will track airspeed similar to altitude, increasing and decreasing as the plane ascends and descends. You cannot safely fly without pitot tubes, as a misleadingly high airspeed indication can cause a pilot to reduce power, leading to a stall if the actual airspeed is lower than indicated. Keep this in mind for later. With ice gathering in the pitot tubes, Bonin, the flying pilot, turned the aircraft slightly to the left and decreased its speed from Mach 0.82 to 0.80, which was the recommended speed to penetrate turbulence. The engine anti-ice system was also turned on. Despite this, the pitot tubes would continue to freeze over. At 2:10:05 a.m., the autopilot disengaged, most likely because the pitot tubes were completely frozen over and the aircraft transitioned from normal law to alternate law 2. This means a failure has occurred, causing the flight control system to degrade, removing most envelope protections while retaining some load factor protection. In this mode, there are no limits on pitch attitude or bank angle, and the autopilot is lost, requiring the crew to take a more direct manual control role. The engine's auto-thrust systems disengaged 3 seconds later. The autopilot disconnect warning was heard on the CVR. Bonin took manual control of the aircraft. Without the autopilot, turbulence caused the aircraft to start to roll to the right, and Bonin reacted by deflecting his side stick to the left. One consequence of the change of Alt 2 was an increase in the aircraft's sensitivity to roll, and the pilot overcorrected. During the next 30 seconds, the aircraft rolled alternately left and right as he adjusted to the altered handling characteristics of the aircraft. At the same time, he abruptly pulled back on his side stick, raising the nose. This action was unnecessary and excessive under the circumstances. The aircraft's stall warning briefly sounded twice because the angle of attack tolerance was exceeded, and the aircraft's indicated airspeed dropped sharply from 274 to 52 knots. Remember, the pitot tubes are blocked, so this may not be entirely accurate. The aircraft's angle of attack increased, and the aircraft subsequently began to climb above its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. During this ascent, the aircraft attained vertical speeds well in excess of the typical rate of climb for the Airbus A330, which typically ascends at rates no greater than 2,000 feet per minute. The aircraft experienced a peak vertical speed close to 7,000 feet per minute, which occurred as Bonin brought the rolling movements under control. At 2:10:34 a.m., after displaying incorrectly for half a minute, the left side instruments recorded a sharp rise in airspeed to 223 knots, as did the integrated standby instrument system 33 seconds later. The right side instruments were not recorded by the FDR. The icing event had lasted for just over a minute, yet Bonin continued to make nose-up inputs. The trimmable horizontal stabilizer moved from 3 to 13 degrees nose up in about 1 minute and remained in the latter position until the end of the flight. At 2:11:10 a.m., the aircraft had climbed to its maximum altitude around 38,000 feet. At this point, the aircraft's angle of attack was 16 degrees, and the engine thrust levers were in fully forward takeoff, go-around, or toga detent. As the aircraft began to descend, the angle of attack rapidly increased toward 30 degrees. A second consequence of the reconfiguration into Alt-2 was that the stall protection no longer operated, whereas in normal law, the aircraft's flight management computers would have acted to prevent such a high angle of attack. The wings lost lift and the aircraft began to stall. A stall is a reduction in the life coefficient generated by a foil as angle of attack exceeds its critical value, and therefore the aircraft begins to fall. Confused, Bonin exclaimed, "I don't have control of the aircraft anymore now." And 2 seconds later, quote, "I don't have any control of the aircraft at all." First Officer Robert responded to this by saying, quote, "Controls to the left," and took over control of the aircraft. He pushed his side stick forward to lower the nose and recover from the stall. However, Bonin was still pulling his side stick back. The inputs canceled out and triggered an audible dual input warning. At 2:11:40 a.m., Dubois re-entered the cockpit after being summoned by Robert. The angle of attack had then reached 40 degrees, and the aircraft had descended to 35,000 feet, with the engines running at almost 100% N1, or the rotational speed of the front intake fan, which delivers most of a turbofan engine's thrust. The stall warning stopped, as all airspeed indications were now considered invalid by the aircraft's computer because of the high angle of attack. The aircraft had its nose above the horizon, but was descending steeply. About 20 seconds later, Bonin decreased the aircraft's pitch slightly. Airspeed indications became valid and the stall warning sounded again. It then sounded intermittently for the remaining duration of the flight, stopping only when the pilots increased the aircraft's nose-up pitch. From there until the end of the flight, the angle of attack never dropped below 35 degrees. From the time the aircraft stalled until its impact with the ocean, the engines were primarily developing either 100% N1 or toga thrust, though they were briefly spooled down to about 50% N1 on 2 occasions. The engines always responded to commands and were developing in excess of 100% N1 when the flight ended. Robert responded to Dubois by saying, quote, "We've lost all control of the aeroplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." Soon after this, Robert said to himself, "Climb," 4 consecutive times. Bonin heard this and replied, quote, "But I've been at maximum nose up for a while." When Dubois heard this, he realized Bonin was causing the stall and shouted, "No, no, no, don't climb. No, no, no." When Robert heard this, he told Bonin to give him control of the aircraft, and Bonin initially obliged. The aircraft was now too low to recover from the stall, but the 3 pilots didn't know this yet. Robert pushed his side stick forward to try to regain lift in order to get out of the stall. However, shortly thereafter, the ground proximity warning system sounded a sink rate alarm followed by pull-up alarms. In response, Bonin, without informing his colleagues, pulled his side stick all the way back again, and Robert said, quote, "We're going to crash. This can't be true." Bonin said, quote, "But what's happening?" The last recording on the CVR was Dubois saying, quote, 10 degrees pitch attitude. Both flight recorders stopped recording at 2:14:28 a.m. UTC, 3 hours and 45 minutes after takeoff. At that point, the aircraft's ground speed was recorded as 107 knots and the aircraft was descending at 10,912 feet per minute, a vertical speed of 108 knots. Its pitch was 16.2 degrees nose up, with a roll angle of 5.3 degrees to the left. During its descent, the aircraft had turned more than 180 degrees to the right, to a compass heading of 270 degrees. The aircraft remained stalled during its entire 3-minute, 30-second descent from 38,000 feet. The aircraft struck the ocean belly first at a speed of 152 knots, comprising vertical and horizontal component of 108 knots and 107 knots respectively. All 228 passengers and crew on board died upon impact from extreme trauma, and the aircraft was destroyed. Rest in peace to the passengers and crew of Air France Flight 447. Remember, the flight was still in a communications dead zone, and it was due to pass into Senegalese airspace around 2:20 a.m., and then into Cape Verdean airspace at roughly 3:45 a.m. Shortly after 4 a.m., when the flight had failed to contact air traffic control in either Senegal or Cape Verde, the controller in Senegal attempted to contact the aircraft. When he received no response, he asked the crew of another Air France flight, AF459, to try to contact the flight. And obviously, there was no response. And there would only ever be silence. If you like history and disasters, make sure to check out my other channel, Shipwreck Sunday. I post there every Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, let's look at the aftermath. After an extensive search, the CVR and FDR would be recovered, with the flight recorders being taken aboard the French Navy patrol boat La Capricieuse for transport to the port of Cayenne. On May 15, 2011, all data was downloaded and it was analyzed over the next few weeks, and the findings were published in a report at the end of July. From the time of the crash on June 1, 2009 to June 3, 2011, 154 bodies were recovered, leaving 74 unrecovered. Just after the crash, Air France established a crisis center at Terminal 2D for the 60 to 70 relatives and friends who arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport to pick up arriving passengers. But many of the passengers on Flight 447 were connecting to other destinations worldwide. In the days that followed, Air France contacted close to 2,000 people who were related to or friends of the victims. On June 20, 2009, Air France announced that each victim's family would be paid roughly 17,500 euros in initial compensation. According to the final report, the plane crashed for numerous reasons. Firstly, the obstruction of the pitot tubes with ice crystals, which caused autopilot disconnection and reconfiguration to alternate law. Next, we had human error at play, with the crew making inappropriate control inputs that destabilized the flight path, failing to follow appropriate procedure for loss of displayed airspeed information, lacking understanding of the approach to stall, failing to recognize the aircraft had stalled and therefore did not make inputs that would have made recovering from a stall possible, and they were too late to identify and correct the deviation from the flight path. These events resulted from multiple major factors in conjunction with one another. Firstly, feedback mechanisms between all those involved, including manufacturers, operators, flight crews, and regulatory agencies, made it impossible to identify repeated non-application of the loss of airspeed information procedure and to ensure that crews were trained in icing of the pitot tube probes and its consequences. Secondly, the crew's lack of practical training in manually handling the aircraft both at high altitude and in the event of anomalies of speed indication. Third, the weakening of the two co-pilots' task sharing, both by incomprehension of the situation at the time of autopilot disconnection and by poor management of the startle effect, leaving them in an emotionally charged state. Fourth, the cockpit's lack of a clear display of the inconsistencies in airspeed readings identified by the flight computers. And lastly, the crew's lack of response to the stall warning, whether due to a failure to identify the oral warning, to the transience of the stall warnings that could have been considered spurious, to the absence of any visual information that could confirm that the aircraft was approaching stall after losing the characteristic speeds, to confusing stall-related buffet for overspeed-related buffet, to the indications by the flight director that might have confirmed the crew's mistaken view of their actions, or to difficulty in identifying and understanding the implications of the switch to alternate law, which does not protect the angle of attack. Tragically, if the pilots had simply let good enough alone and continued navigating like normal for a few moments, the pitot tubes had a chance to clear and the airspeed indicator would have been accurate once more. Or, had the pilots realized there was dual input and had worked together, things would have turned out differently. This was most definitely recoverable, and it makes it all the more tragic. The most important thing to remember here is that 228 passengers and crew were killed in this accident. Thousands of family members, friends, and loved ones felt the shockwaves of devastation and continue to feel it to this day. Rest in peace to those who died in the crash of Air France Flight 447, and may their loved ones find closure.